2 years. Then I got there 5 years.
For over 2 decades, the world watched Celine Dion soar to unimaginable heights, selling millions of records, dominating international charts, and redefining what it meant to be a global icon. But few stopped to consider the weight that would be placed on the shoulders of the tiny boy she held in her arms. Raised in a world of private jets, sold-out arenas, and velvet-curtained dressing rooms, René Charles wasn't simply growing up. He was growing up as the son of one of the most recognizable voices on the planet. Expectations were not whispered. They were broadcasted. He would surely become a singer, many believed, inheriting the extraordinary musical legacy of his mother. For years, the public waited, watching for signs, speculating when he would take the stage. But while the world leaned in, eager to hear his first note, René Charles quietly turned away. For over 2 decades, he remained largely silent in public, rarely giving interviews, avoiding social media spotlights, and refusing to let others define his path. And then, at 24, he finally spoke, not with a dramatic performance, but with an honest revelation about who he truly is and what he's chosen to become. His words, though simple, sent shockwaves across fan communities. They didn't confirm a musical debut. They confirmed something deeper, a life lived on his own terms, away from the spotlight that chased him since birth. As he began to open up about the years he spent carving his own identity, people began to understand the pressures he had faced, the fears his mother had carried, and the secrets their family had long protected. What he revealed didn't just speak to his own journey. It shed new light on Celine Dion's deepest devotion, not to fame, but to family. And so began the real story of René Charles, not the version written by tabloids, but the truth that had waited patiently behind closed doors. To the outside world, René Charles was living a dream, a life surrounded by music, fame, and privilege. His mother was not just any singer. She was the voice behind "My Heart Will Go On," the woman who changed the definition of success for a female artist in both French and English-speaking worlds. By the time he was in preschool, Celine Dion had already achieved global superstardom, broken sales records, and built a concert venue specifically for her own residency in Las Vegas. But behind the polished veneer of luxury and lights, René Charles' early years were shaped by something far more complex than stardom: silence. Celine and René, his parents, had made a very deliberate choice to shield their son from the chaos of fame. Though she continued to perform for millions, Celine became fiercely private when it came to her child. She rarely brought him to public events, rarely spoke of him in interviews beyond the occasional proud mention, and always ensured that cameras remained at bay during family moments. It wasn't just an instinct, it was protection. She had been mocked relentlessly as a child for her appearance and ridiculed even during her rise to fame. She knew what a cruel spotlight could do to a young spirit, and she had no intention of letting that same harshness touch her son. So she raised him quietly, with care and caution, within the walls of guarded estates and backstage corridors. As a toddler, René Charles would sit in the front row of rehearsals, mesmerized by the sound of his mother's voice echoing through empty arenas. When the music stopped and the lights faded, she was still Mom. And that was enough. He learned early on that the price of fame was isolation. His mother's schedule was grueling, her health often strained, and his father, once a vibrant force, was now increasingly dependent on medical care. The Angélil household wasn't just glamorous. It was filled with tension, with worry, with the quiet hum of machines and the unsaid questions of a child trying to understand why Dad was always tired. As Celine traveled the world, she brought René Charles with her when she could. But even amidst the roar of audiences and the flashing of paparazzi cameras, she created a cocoon around him. Tutors were hired, security was constant, and trust was reserved only for those within a very tight circle. René Charles learned to smile when needed, stay silent when expected. Other kids didn't fly on private planes or wake up in hotel suites. But he also knew that what mattered most was what happened when the doors closed and the crowds went home. There, It was just family, a mother doing her best to juggle love, legacy, and a silent heartbreak growing behind her eyes as she watched her husband slip further away. As he got older, René Charles became more aware of the expectations the world had placed on him. They wanted him to sing, to carry the torch, to become the next Dion. But with every passing year, it became clearer he had no intention of following a script someone else had written. By the time René Charles reached adolescence, the contrast between who the world thought he should be and who he actually was had never been more pronounced. While his peers were discovering who they were in relative anonymity, he was doing so under the watchful eye of a global audience, many of whom believed his future was already written. But from a young age, René Charles harbored a quiet determination to forge his own identity. At first, he tried to blend in. He enrolled in private schools, wore the same brands as his classmates, and took part in sports like any regular teen. Ice hockey became his escape, and for a time, it seemed like it might be his path. But even then, the whispers followed him. He was the son of Celine Dion, the boy whose every move was laced with speculation. Still, he kept his thoughts to himself. He didn't rebel loudly. He didn't lash out at the press. Instead, he learned how to navigate the world on his own terms, carving out spaces where he could just be René, without the weight of Charles, Dion, or Angélil attached. But even in his quiet defiance, the world kept guessing. Was he secretly training as a vocalist? Was his mother grooming him for a surprise debut? Would he step on stage at one of her concerts and stun the crowd with an inherited voice? The answer was always the same: no. René Charles wasn't drawn to the spotlight like his mother. He wasn't chasing applause. What he wanted was something few children of icons ever get: the freedom to fail without headlines, to dream without comparison, and to succeed on his own merit. That desire led him down unexpected paths. While he kept most of his teenage years private, those closest to him knew he was experimenting with music, with identity, with life. He listened to hip-hop, not ballads. He wrote lyrics in English, not French. And when he finally released his first EP in 2021, he didn't promote it as the son of Celine Dion. He used a pseudonym. He dropped the Dion entirely. Under the name RC Angel, he quietly uploaded a 5-track hip-hop EP to SoundCloud. The production was raw. The lyrics were personal. The reception was mixed. Some fans were surprised by the genre. Others applauded his authenticity. But the most powerful message wasn't in the music. It was in the silence surrounding its release. I Am Me. Celine, for her part, supported him unconditionally. While she may have once dreamed of a musical legacy, she had come to understand that the greatest legacy she could leave her son was not fame, but freedom. In private, she praised his courage, encouraged his independence, and reminded him often that he was loved not because of what he could do, but because of who he already was. Behind the scenes, she remained his fiercest protector. Even as her health began to decline and her public appearances became more limited, she never stopped cheering for her son's quiet rebellion. She didn't need him to be a pop star. She just needed him to be happy. In an era when many children of celebrities chased the fame their parents had already mastered, René Charles was doing something far more radical. He was walking away from it. While René Charles was quietly forging his own path, one truth remained ever present. He was his father's son. René Angélil had not only shaped Celine Dion's career. Feeding tubes replaced dinner conversations. Medical staff became a regular presence in their household. Yet, even in the face of such sorrow, but to face it with compassion, they learned how to comfort René Sr. together, how to navigate the grief that comes in waves, and how to keep the memory of joy alive amidst the silence of decline. When René Sr. passed away in January 2016, it wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of an era. For René Charles, it was the first time he truly faced the world without the steady presence of his father behind him. And yet, even in grief, he didn't crumble. Instead, he became even more protective of his mother and ensuring that his younger twin brothers, Nelson and Eddie, never felt the absence of their father too deeply. At only 15, He was thrust into a role many men twice his age would struggle to fill. And Celine? She saw it all. Though devastated by the loss of her husband, she found new purpose in the love and support of her eldest son. As Celine's health began to deteriorate and her voice, once indestructible, began to falter under the grip of a rare and merciless illness, it was René Charles who remained steady, quiet, loyal. He didn't run from responsibility. He didn't chase fame for distraction. Instead, he stayed. And slowly, the world began to realize. While he may not have followed in his mother's footsteps musically, he had inherited something far more powerful, the heart that had made her a legend. For decades, Celine Dion had been known for her seemingly limitless vocal range, her commanding presence on stage, and her endurance as an international performer. But by the early 2020s, something had begun to shift, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Her once reliable voice started to betray her. Her body, so full of vitality and grace, began to falter. And in 2022, the world learned why. The diagnosis was both rare and terrifying: stiff person syndrome, a condition so unusual that fewer than 2 people per million are affected by it. And yet, she chose to let the world see what living with this condition meant, not just for her, but for those who loved her. In the documentary I Am, Celine Dion, released in 2024, she allowed cameras into her most vulnerable moments. In one harrowing scene, she experiences a full-blown seizure while recording music. Her body locks. Her voice disappears. Her team scrambles. For nearly 8 minutes, she is trapped inside her own muscles. And by her side, always is her family. René Charles, now 23 at the time, stepped into a role few could imagine. No magazine covers, no applause, just the quiet, daily rhythm of devotion. A son watching over the woman who had spent a lifetime watching over him. Celine, in turn, gave everything she had left to ensure her sons felt loved, safe, and prepared. She knew her illness might one day silence her completely, so she spoke when she could. The world had long assumed that Celine Dion's legacy would be her music. But to those closest to her, the real legacy was this: the way she loved and the way she raised her sons to love in return. And in that love, they found a way to weather even the most unpredictable storms. By 2025, René Charles Angélil had become a man the world barely recognized, but couldn't ignore. He was quietly carving out a future, one that surprised even those who thought they knew him best. His first love, though carefully kept out of the spotlight, had always been music, but not the sweeping orchestral ballads of his mother. He preferred heavy beats, lyrical flow, and the raw energy of hip-hop. It wasn't rebellion, it was identity. Under the moniker RC Angel, he released a 5-track EP in 2021. The style was bold, the lyrics honest, and while the production lacked the polish of a major label, it pulsed with authenticity. Some critics were harsh, deliberately and without apology. Still, he remained fiercely loyal to the musical roots that surrounded his upbringing. In private, he helped Celine organize recordings, digital archives. René Charles took a turn that no one, not even Celine, had seen coming. In July 2025, the poker world was stunned when a quiet, focused young man advanced deep into the World Series of Poker main event. Among nearly 10,000 entrants from around the globe, calculated game, mimicking the style of someone who'd grown up watching strategy and learning patience from master. Because his father, René Angélil, had been a seasoned poker player. In fact, had found solace in the quiet calculations and high stakes of the card table. Now, it was his son who sat under the lights, surrounded by tension, mind sharp, eyes calm. René Charles didn't wear his name like a badge. He didn't ask for attention, but the story was too compelling to ignore. A son stepping into the game his father had once loved, not to chase the past, but to continue a silent legacy. He ended that tournament with more than $70,000 in winnings and something far greater: respect. It was a victory of identity. One hand at a time, he showed the world he could stand at the crossroads of heritage and individuality without being swallowed by either. Celine, watching from the sidelines, was moved in a way few could understand. Music in one hand, cards in the other, discipline from his mother, grit from his father. René Charles wasn't choosing one path. He was weaving both into something entirely his own. In every interview, every performance, and every public appearance, there was always an unmistakable thread running through Celine Dion's life: love. The lights of the stage seemed colder. The music, though still powerful, now carried a trace of ache. But Celine didn't disappear into grief. She transformed it. She poured her energy into motherhood, into being present, into protecting what they had built together. Even as she struggled privately with her illness, she remained active in her children's lives. And more than that, she stayed open to the unseen. In several interviews, Celine admitted to feeling René's presence after his death. She spoke not in superstition, but in certainty. When the nights were long or the pain too much to bear, she would close her eyes and speak to him. She believed that he was still there, watching, guiding, listening. And that belief comforted her children, especially René Charles, who had lost not just a father, but the quiet compass of his youth. In moments of doubt, he too, a pause before speaking, a sense that the room wasn't entirely empty. The Angélil Dion home became more than just a sanctuary. It became a place where love didn't die when a person passed. It evolved. It remained. In 2023, when Celine received yet another career honor, this time ranked among the top 10 greatest Canadian artists by Rolling Stone, she didn't use the moment to speak about her own triumph. Instead, she acknowledged those who had carried her to that place. She spoke of René, of her children, of the audience that never stopped believing. She knew the industry had changed. Her illness had taken her off the stage. Her body could no longer endure the grueling pace of global tours. But her story, her voice, those things hadn't faded. They had simply shifted from spotlight to legacy. And part of that legacy now lived in René Charles. Not in the way the world had expected, but in the way it truly mattered. He didn't need to become a pop star. He didn't need to perform ballads or sell out arenas. His existence, his protection of his family, and his quiet strength were enough. He said nothing, offering silence as a shield instead of a statement. Theirs was a love story, too. Not of romance, but of endurance. A mother who gave the world her soul, and a son who now gave her his heart in return. As the years moved forward, so too did the narrative surrounding Celine Dion and her son. The world, once fixated on her chart-topping songs and glamorous performances, began to see another version of her story, one rooted not in fame, but in humanity. Her illness, once a private battle, had now become a window through which millions viewed courage in its rawest form. And by her side, always was René Charles. While most young adults his age were building careers, exploring freedom, or navigating early adulthood with trial and error, René Charles chose something different: presence. He became the steady rhythm in a life once defined by high notes and dazzling crescendos. He didn't walk away from the world, nor did he fully embrace its spotlight. Instead, he occupied a space in between, visible only when necessary, but deeply woven into everything that mattered. When Celine's symptoms worsened and stiff person syndrome took firmer control of her body, it was René Charles who adapted his life to hers. He coordinated appointments. He understood medical terminology. He rearranged his own ambitions to ensure someone was always close. He stayed in Las Vegas, not because he had to, but because she needed him. This was not a sacrifice. It was instinct. Those close to the family often remarked on the unspoken communication between them. A glance from her, a nod from him, a subtle shift in energy that told them everything. It wasn't performative. It was real. It was earned through shared pain. And through it all, René Charles never once played the victim. He embraced the role of caregiver with quiet dignity. But he wasn't only existing for his mother. Away from the cameras, he continued to nurture his own passions. Music remained a creative outlet, and poker, surprisingly, became more than a hobby. With each tournament, he gained experience. He studied strategies, read opponents, and carved a name for himself that had nothing to do with vocals or arenas. His calm, calculated demeanor, so unlike the flamboyant style many expected, began to earn him respect. It was the same steadiness he showed at home, now applied to a table where a single misstep could cost everything. And just like with his music, he never flaunted his name. He earned every chip, every hand, every nod. This dual life, one of devotion and quiet ambition, was never part of the plan. But René Charles had never been interested in plans made by others. He had watched his mother rise from poverty to global icon. He had watched his father build an empire from belief. And now, in his own way, he was carrying that legacy forward, not through spectacle, but through substance. The world had finally begun to understand. He was not a prince waiting to inherit a kingdom. He was an architect building something entirely new. And the blueprint? Love, loyalty, and the kind of strength that never needs to be shouted. As the Dion Angélil family navigated a life vastly different from the one they had envisioned, there was still a quiet, persistent question echoing beneath the surface. What comes next? For Celine, the answer remained layered. Though stiff person syndrome had changed the way she could live and nearly silenced her singing voice, her identity as an artist hadn't faded. Even when her body betrayed her, her mind remained sharp, her spirit intact. She continued to create, to write, to dream. Her music, even when not performed, still pulsed within her. There were whispers of unreleased tracks, voice memos stored on phones, lyrics written in the stillness of pain. The world may have stopped hearing her in concert halls, but those closest to her knew. The music was far from over. It had simply shifted to a new frequency, one only a few could hear. René Charles heard it best. He became her bridge, not just between doctor and patient, but between past and future. He understood the nuance of her catalog, the subtle shifts in her voice across decades, the deep emotional context behind every melody. And slowly, as Celine's physical performances waned, her son began quietly preserving her legacy in new ways. He organized her archives, cataloged footage, helped digitize memories, and perhaps most notably, he began working very quietly on remastering certain unreleased projects. It wasn't about capitalizing on her name. It was about honoring the work she had poured her soul into. Projects left incomplete due to illness, grief, or exhaustion were now receiving a second life, this time through her son's hands. Some producers close to the family spoke, anonymously, about his ear for detail, how he could detect imperfections most others missed, how he approached every project with care, not as a fan, but as a son determined to protect something sacred. And as the world waited, unaware, René Charles was quietly shaping the future of Celine's artistic legacy. But he didn't stop there. The poker community, still surprised by his success at the World Series of Poker, began to see him not as a novelty, but as a real contender. He entered more tournaments, played longer games, one more often, and each time, one that chronicled what it meant to grow up at the intersection of unimaginable fame and relentless privacy. A life filled with velvet ropes and hospital beds, with applause and emergency alarms. A life where everything glittered, but not everything was gold. If it ever comes to life, it may surprise readers expecting gossip or grandeur. Because René Charles was never interested in spectacle. His story, like his mother's most powerful songs, was rooted in emotion, in survival, and in truth. And through all of this, one truth remained constant. The Dion Angélil name had never been about perfection. It had always been about perseverance. A family that came from modest beginnings. A couple who defied the odds. A woman who gave everything to her voice. A man who believed in her before the world did. And now, a son who had taken all of it, not as pressure, but as a promise. He would not replace them. He would not perform their parts. But he would carry their legacy with humility, strength, and a new voice of his own. For much of her career, Celine Dion stood beneath the glow of stage lights. once expected to follow her into the arena, had instead become the quiet architect of a new legacy. He didn't belt out high notes. He didn't sell out tours. But his voice, composed of loyalty, discipline, and compassion, carried just as much weight. While the world reminisced about Celine's golden days, her son helped her redefine what it meant to be an icon, not a performance, but of perseverance. And her twins, Nelson and Eddie, now approaching adulthood themselves, were learning by example. Raised in a household where illness, love, and music were braided together like notes in a chord, they were not sheltered, but shaped. While they remained largely out of public view, those close to the family spoke of their sensitivity. Celine's once legendary voice, though now often silenced by her condition, continued to echo through the very people she had raised. Her values, her empathy, her unstoppable will had not disappeared. They had taken new forms, and the world finally began to understand. The truest legacies are not always recorded in charts or awards. Sometimes, they're recorded in the daily routines of caregiving, in the quiet decision to stay when it's easier to leave, in the long nights beside a hospital bed, in the way a son holds his mother's hand when the rest of the world stops looking. That was the real encore. In interviews, Celine was asked if she missed the stage. Her answer was simple. The stage was never just a place for me to sing. It was where I connected. But I've found deeper connection now. With my children. With the parts of myself I never had time to know. She hadn't disappeared. She had reemerged in softer light on a quieter stage, surrounded not by fans, but by family. And in this transformation, René Charles had proven something more powerful than any vocal range. He had shown the world that sometimes the strongest performances are the ones no one sees. In the story of Celine Dion and her family, no symbol has resonated more powerfully than the heart. Her most iconic song, My Heart Will Go On, transcended language and culture, becoming a global anthem for love, loss, and resilience. But for Celine, that message wasn't just something she sang. It was something she lived. And now, her children were carrying it forward in ways no one could have foreseen. As her body slowly surrendered to a rare condition that made the simplest movements agonizing, Celine never lost her capacity to give, to love, to inspire. Her home, once a sanctuary for rehearsals and costume fittings, had transformed into a place of healing, not just for herself, but for those around her. She welcomed the press into her life again, but not to promote an album. Instead, to raise awareness for a disease that stole her stage, but not her strength. Her decision to let the world witness her seizure in the 2024 documentary wasn't an act of spectacle. It was an act of courage. She wanted the world to understand the reality behind the headlines. That even legends can fall. That even the strongest voices can tremble. And that there is no shame in needing help. René Charles stood behind that choice. He supported it. Made sure emergency plans were in place. It was routine, but never robotic. It was structured, but always loving. And in that daily rhythm, something beautiful emerged, a new kind of harmony. Not one made of instruments, but of souls in sync. Celine, watching her sons grow into men of compassion, often said she felt her late husband watching, too. That she could sense René's pride, especially in the quiet moments when the cameras were off and the lights were dim. She didn't need ovations anymore. She had something far more precious, peace. It was about legacy, humanity, and the reminder that no matter how fragile the body becomes, the heart can still endure. Her sons, especially René Charles, had made sure of that. He never needed to prove anything. Not to the media, not to the industry, not even to himself. His life had already proven what mattered most, that the heart truly does go on, not in song, but in love, in sacrifice, in quiet, unseen strength. And in this new chapter, it was not Celine who carried the melody forward. It was the family she built, the sons she raised, the love she gave without condition. They were not following in her footsteps. They were walking beside her. By the summer of 2025, the world had changed. So had the narrative around celebrity, and by how gracefully one carried the invisible weight of life behind the scenes. For René Angélil, the weight had been present from the very beginning. Born to one of the most powerful voices on earth and the man who helped build that empire, he had been handed a legacy steeped in reverence and expectation. But he never buckled. He never ran. He simply chose a quieter path. That choice, once questioned by many, now appeared prophetic. In the halls of poker tournaments, he was no longer just a celebrity child. He was a respected competitor. In the realm of music, he wasn't chasing chart positions. He was creating on his terms, blending influences from a life filled with orchestras and bass lines. And at home, where it mattered most, he was the foundation of a family weathering the slow-moving storm of illness. Through every choice, René Charles made it clear. He wasn't trying to escape the Dion name. He was honoring it in his own way, not by replicating it, but by evolving it. And the evolution didn't stop with him. Nelson and Eddie, though far younger, were growing up in a home where love wasn't just spoken, it was practiced, where tears weren't hidden, but accepted, where the most important skill wasn't performance, it was presence. These boys weren't being raised to be stars. They were being raised to be steady. In a world obsessed with visibility, this family had chosen something radical, to be real. Celine, even as her physical strength declined, continued to lead with dignity. She no longer stood before thousands in glittering gowns. She sat at the head of a dinner table, surrounded by sons who didn't need a performance to feel awe, who saw their mother not as a fallen icon, but as the strongest woman they knew. And in doing so, they redefined what legacy really meant. It wasn't about fame that lasted forever. It was about love that never left. When asked by a close friend what he wanted his future to look like, René Charles didn't speak of Grammys or headlines. He spoke of balance, of being able to create freely, care for his family, and maybe one day pass on the same values he had been taught, not through lectures, but through example. Because in him, she saw not just survival, but continuation. Not an echoes, but an evolution. There comes a point in every legendary life where the spotlight begins to dim, where the cheers fade, the stages go dark, and the final notes of a song echo into memory. For most stars, that moment marks the end. Celine had found something more enduring than fame. Freedom. Freedom to be vulnerable. Freedom to rest. Freedom to exist as more than a symbol. And in that space, her family flourished. René Charles didn't ride the wave of nostalgia that surrounded his mother's name. He didn't seek to replicate her path or cash in on her legacy. Instead, he stepped quietly and confidently into a life of his own making. He used music not as a spotlight, but as expression. He used poker not as a distraction, but as a discipline. And most importantly, he used his presence as a way to protect, support, and uplift the people who mattered most. In doing so, he became the kind of man his father would have been proud of, not because of celebrity, but because of character. For Celine, watching her eldest son grow into a leader, a guardian, and a creator was its own kind of encore. One not seen by millions. To Eddie, to a family that didn't just endure loss, but turned it into strength. To a legacy that wasn't just performed, but lived. And that, perhaps, is the most profound truth of their story. That even when the music stops, the heart goes on, not through sound, but through love, through loyalty, through the quiet courage to live life, not for applause, but for meaning. And in that way, the Dion Angel legacy is far from over. It's just begun.